going on, guys, and welcome back to the Bridging the Gap podcast. Today we have a very, very special guest. We have one half of the Muscle Mentors, Calum Raistrick. He is also my coach, and it is amazing to be up here. We had a monster session earlier. Struggled to get my food down after, and we've got another one tomorrow. So I'm up here to get as much value to you guys here as possible, without taking too much time, of course. And I want to run through a few things. I want to run through a little bit on nutrition, a little bit on training. I want to get the most important things out first because I've got a lot of drug questions. Of course, this is the big topic at the moment is the drugs at the moment, but I want to leave that to the end because it is the least important out of these three, and I want to make that clear. And I'm sure Calum will agree on that. So we can just jump straight into it. And I've learned so much from Calum over this past 5 months ish. And the most important thing has been about monitoring your variables, and some variables that I've not known about before. And one thing that a lot of people asked about was digestion. So what I've noticed is my digestion is better than ever. I've actually thought about it, which is what some people don't do. So I'd love to know your take on digestion and how do you look to improve it? So if someone's come to you with poor digestion, what are you doing to improve that?
I think probably from a digestive perspective, it's looking at, instead of, I think the number one thing that people would normally tend to gravitate towards would be, right, we need to supplement with digestive enzymes or acids to help promote better digestive function within that individual. But from our side, as you know full well from direct experience, it's more so looking at putting the body and more specifically the nervous system in the most optimal place to improve digestion just from a foundational level. So all the way from, the state you're in before you eat your meal in terms of autonomic balance and being in a low stress state to how many times you're chewing your food. Like just instead of looking at essentially putting a band-aid over an issue and supplementing with something that is in theory faulty or broken, we're looking at fixing it from the ground up and putting habits and practices in place day to day that will essentially solve these things long term and put you in the best possible place moving forwards to make sure they don't return back to poor ways that they had been in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Calum summarised about you can't put a band-aid on these things. That is the industry at the moment. A quick fix. What supplement is going to fix what? And really, it's not about that. It's about figuring out what the fundamentals and what's going wrong, and it comes down to food choices, and you can supplement a little bit, but essentially it's coming down to food choices, and that's something that I've learned more than anything is food choices, because before I was just pounding whatever I could get, pounding heavy fats, pounding heavy salts, and it fucked my stomach up. That's the reality of it. It fucked my stomach up, and we are inhibited by how much we can eat, as I'm slowly learning through this process. So that's a great take on that. Moving forward more into nutrition. Obviously, I put up on my Instagram talking about how I pulled down my protein. What an uproar. What an uproar that goes. What do you mean you're only eating 180 grams of protein? You're 100 kilos. So I'll let you take why am I eating 180 versus 240 what I was on before, and how much protein should people be eating and what should they be concerned about when it comes to protein per meal or over the day. And essentially what the role is there.
Like if you look at that from a literature perspective, then we can probably maximize muscle protein synthesis and minimize protein breakdown with a pretty minimal bolus dose of protein across the day if we want to be more specific about things. And I think it is a bit of a folklore, bro sciencey type scenario where the whole notion of 1.5 or 1.3 grams per pound is absolutely a prerequisite for one to be able to build tissue or retain tissue. It's not really relevant. It's looking at, for me, you look at all the macronutrients, fat and protein are probably the two hardest things to break down. Fat requiring a lot of bile acids and specific things within the digestive tract to break them down, and protein being one of the most taxing on the digestive system as a whole. And even from the perspective of looking at the surface area of those proteins, we're going to require a lot of chewing. Most people aren't chewing their food sufficiently, which means that these foods are coming down into the digestive tract in larger pieces and structures than they realistically should be being digested from. So they're going to be relatively taxing on the digestive system. So from our perspective, one's ability to eat and eat sufficiently is going to ultimately determine their ability to grow. And from your perspective, Josh, it's a case of putting you on the minimal, least effective dose possible for protein. The same we do for volume, the same we're going to speak about later in terms of drug use. It's looking at, realistically, if we're looking at this long term, what's the minimal amount we can get for the maximum amount of a response. And from a protein perspective, 3 to 4 grams of leucine every, realistically, 4 to 5 hours is plenty in terms of maximizing what we would be using protein for in terms of regulating protein synthesis. And we don't need these bolus doses of 40, 50, 60 grams per meal. All they're doing is just placing more stress on our digestive system. So for most bodybuilders, a lot of bodybuilders suffer with digestive issues. A lot of bodybuilders eat high protein diets. A lot of bodybuilders don't chew their foods. There's going to be a correlation there.
Yeah.
And we're starting to kind of debunk a lot of those myths now and putting people in a much better position to grow and optimize their health by just manipulating the diet in more optimal ways and not kind of doing what everyone else has done for the last 50 years because it worked for Arnie. We're learning stuff now we can kind of run with.
Absolutely. And then talking about like macronutrient breakdown and differences between training day versus non-training day. Now, loads of people have different opinions of this. Some people say you need to continue with the same amount of calories on each day so you can refuel and recover. But I know that JP, big people in the industry, Calum as well, you prefer like splitting training day and non-training day from a nutritional approach. Different calories, different macros. What's the thought process? I know the thought process, but I just want it for you guys out there. I had a lot of questions about how come I'm eating different amounts of carbohydrates on training days versus non-training days. So I can let you run with that one.
So, there's nothing wrong with the coach that would present the argument that a 7-day flatline calorie intake and macronutrient intake is going to get you to your goals, because it is. Ultimately, energy balance is still being controlled, and that's the main contributing factor in governing body composition. When we're looking at the extremes here in terms of gaining maximum amounts of lean tissue and someone's ability to inevitably have to drive their food relatively aggressively to get to that point, we've got to think eating the same foods in the same amounts every single day will inevitably start to hinder our ability to eat those foods long term. Because digestive function will be hindered from processing large amounts of the same foods day to day over and over and over again. And B, if we're hammering carbohydrates heavily, training and non-training days, whether we have a demand for them or not, there will eventually be a point of no return or point of diminishing returns where glucose sensitivity will start to diminish. So from a partitioning perspective with training and non-training days, the calorie gaps don't need to be significant. It's more so manipulating macronutrients to give you some form of reset day or a couple of reset days or 3 reset days a week where the digestive system is being taxed less with less amounts of food being pushed through that digestive tract and requiring and demanding less from it. And B, having a period of time, whether that's in the day or whether that's a day within the week, where we're spending longer periods of time with less insulin being produced by the pancreas and less glucose being present in the blood, to essentially mean that when we come back to those higher carbohydrate days, we're going to be much more efficient at utilizing them and driving them into the cell, which is going to be the main goal of us trying to get the most anabolic response from food.
Absolutely. The one thing that I've noticed from starting with Calum is that every little detail is geared towards performance, to nutrient absorption and maximizing everything that we're doing, maximizing the food that's going in, maximizing the training, the output, and really just getting on top of it, because it's so easy to get lost in these calories there and these calories that, and not focusing on the end goal of accruing tissue and putting the work in the gym and being consistently in a progressive diet, while remaining optimal in terms of absorption rates and all that kind of stuff. So that is that's essentially what we're doing on non-training days and training days. And then touching on training, I've got loads of questions. Why the bands? Why the chains? Like, people are absolutely raving for, why am I using this band? Why am I using that band? What is the idea behind these in terms of like strength profiles and training? And one thing I will note before we say is I think I've shifted my focus so much on diet while it's still there, but to actually realizing how important training execution is and training protocol is. Because you can go in there and you can go swing your weight around without your program, and yeah, you're going to get a bit of muscle if you're trying to get stronger over time, but the importance of actually having that routine has really shone through for me this off season. So what's with all the different techniques you're going through?
When you start to get a better grasp of anatomy and exercise mechanics, you can start to put things in place and different variables in place within the training cycle, within the training program, that will apply to that specific exercise or that specific goal of the session to achieve that goal maybe a little bit better or a little bit more efficiently. And it's not to say at all that bands, and manipulating a resistance profile with a band is going to be an essential for creating an adaptation. Far from it, because there are plenty of people that don't use them. But if you know how to use them and you know the why, then they can be a very useful tool within the grand scheme of things. They can't be the only tool you use, but they can be a very useful tool within the grand scheme of things for achieving that long-term goal. And there'll be periods of time where Josh goes through training programs where he doesn't use a band. There'll be periods of times where he goes through a training program where he does use a band, and there'll be a reason why it's there, and there'll be a reason why maybe it won't be there. But any program will work given that your execution is sufficient, you're targeting and stimulating enough tissue, and you're optimizing recovery outside of the gym. Are they absolutely essential for creating that response? No, but can they be a contributing factor in making the most optimal training response? Most definitely.
Absolutely, that makes perfect sense. And then in terms of eliciting that response we need in the gym, one of the questions was training till failure versus reps in reserve. I know that I'm programmed to go to failure on certain exercises. Obviously, we do have like acclimation sets, but the top sets are all out sets. So I'd love to know your thought process. I've got my own thought process on why I prefer going to failure, but I'd love to know, what's your thought process on that? What we're getting at when we go to failure versus saving reps?
It's probably the easiest way to explain whether failure is necessary in the first place is to start to look at two different parties for an untrained and a trained individual. An untrained individual which has a relatively low exposure to adaptation from resistance training and a low exposure to training in the first place in recruiting tissues will definitely be able to spend a long period of time progressing and adapting without going anywhere near true mechanical failure. An untrained individual will have a lower propensity to stimulate high threshold motor units, but they'll recruit more fibers within the process given the same volume that an advanced trainer would have. And that advanced trainer would be able to recruit higher motor unit thresholds, but they're essentially recruiting less tissue within that given volume. Now, the reasons why someone like Josh would potentially want to expose himself to failure more often than someone that was potentially less experienced than Josh is because Josh is going to have to essentially force a stimulus that will require that will basically create more structural change and create more structural change within the cell to then force an adaptation. If an untrained individual was going to train to failure as many times as Josh was, they'd never be able to recover. But because we've got this foundation in place of recovery practices, and Josh has already been training for how many years?
6 years.
6 years, 7 years. And training well for quite a considerable amount of that time as well. We're going to require more exposure to fatigue to actually create those adaptations in the first place, because the body and the cell is a very adaptive mechanism, and over time it's going to get more efficient at not adapting to things that you're throwing at. So failure is a tool, but only if it can be managed, and that's going to be a case of whether someone has an ability to recover from it, or if somebody is relatively fragile in their recovery ability and they're new to training, they definitely don't need to be training to failure. It's also worth noting that any of those mechanisms of hypertrophy taken to a sufficient enough point of fatigue will stimulate the same amount of motor unit recruitment, which means that any of those mechanisms we can elicit a hypertrophy adaptation, and any of those mechanisms taken to a sufficient point of fatigue that doesn't actually mean has to go to complete failure will also elicit hypertrophic adaptation. But the main thing is that the more advanced an individual is, there is a higher propensity that they're probably going to have to go closer to and or go to failure to achieve the same level of adaptation that untrained individual would, using the same amount of volume, obviously having to go to failure less.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. Explained very well. So if you're a newbie out there, start with a few reps and reserves and build yourself up over the years and notice the response changes. And if the changes aren't happening as quick, maybe try a little bit harder and see what happens, getting closer to that failure, like Calum said. But also the biggest part of that, what I can take is recovery, and how much you can recover will dictate how much you can do in the gym. So if you could outline, I don't know, maybe 3 to 5 of your top recovery variables that we're tracking, which I don't think a lot of people will be tracking, because a lot of people just eat and train and that's where they finish. So what are the management techniques that we're using currently from a recovery standpoint?
Data tracking perspective, so they're mostly, one thing I forgot to mention on the failure bit as well, is this, you view, if people view it as with training, with any faculty in terms of whether it's a sport or whether it's you're training for bodybuilding, we've got to earn the right to move with speed, and we've got to earn the right to train to failure, and that's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah.
And like you said, having everything in place to make sure that we can actually respond positively to do that type of training. Data tracking wise, so most of the stuff that we're tracking will be related to essentially putting things in place to make sure that the nervous system's in the most optimal manner to respond and function, all the way from neurotransmitter production to the state of the autonomic nervous system. So you've got parasympathetic, you've got sympathetic, and that will be indicative in resting heart rate, which will be one thing we track. It will be indicative in heart rate variability, which will be another thing we track. HRV, most people abbreviate it to, will measure, and especially one that will be more apparent for Josh soon, will measure blood pressure, elevated stress and chronic stress, or an individual that's overreaching. Any stress response repeated for a long enough period of time will create vasoconstriction, which will increase blood pressure. So blood pressure can be a pretty good sign of stress response being present. Blood glucose is another one, working in the same manner. Liver's going to kind of liberate glucose into the blood at a response from stress, more sympathetic dominance. So typically blood glucose management will be poorer, and fasted blood glucose will be elevated when we're in a more stressed state. We're tracking sleep, so sleep's going to be something we try and optimize the efficiency of, which Josh has been pretty darn good at for the last 5 months, just because of his habits and his lifestyle. And what else are we tracking? Resting heart rate, HRV, blood glucose, blood pressure, sleep, digestion. So even like any subjective, so all of those things will be objective. Either a machine or an app is telling us what the figure is. We have no control of what that's telling us, which is great, because it means that Josh can't basically influence what the data is telling me. But we've got more subjective feedback markers as well, by feedback, how he's feeling, how he feels training performance is going, his readiness to train, how he feels, even down to perceived recovery or perceived sleep quality in terms of how he feels it's going personally. From a digestive perspective, we've got any known digestive irregularities, any discomfort, any bloating, any flatulence, any irregularities in motility. So that's basically stools or Josh's movements throughout the day in terms of their quality, in terms of their frequency. Look at something like the Bristol stool chart, and we can rate 1 to 7 what type of stool that was. It may sound a bit weird, but there's a place and time for it. How many times he's going across the day. Are there any specific foods that are creating an inflammatory response or being reactive within the diet? And there are a couple of things that we figured out early on that we took out pretty quickly because we knew that you weren't responding favourably to them. And even from a digestive perspective, we can use, going back to the foundations of heart rate or blood glucose, we can use those two markers to actually identify foods that are being inflammatory or are creating these immune responses within the body, because any inflammatory food that we consume that we're not going to agree with will create a stress response, and that stress response will be shown within your heart rate and your heart rate's ability to return to baseline, or the same manner goes for blood glucose as well. So essentially what you'll find is, it may seem anal to somebody that's not informed about why these things are important, but essentially we've got a coaching system now and coaching practices that allow us to control every system that Josh needs to worry about and essentially control every single variable. And if anything is off, we can highlight it straight away and know what's going on.
Amazing. That's exactly the response I wanted to hear, because the big thing at the moment is sleep, and sleep is great, but there is so much more to the details that you could be tracking, and you should be tracking if your goal is to be a bodybuilder and a professional. This is what you should be tracking from the start, and putting yourself in the best position to maximize your muscle gaining potential or fat loss potential, because all of these things will affect that in the long run, and the longer those things are out of whack, the harder it is to get to where you want to go. So I wanted to we'll leave those ones there for the nutrition, training and recovery. I hope you guys understand how important these things are, and all of these things should be in place before we talk about the next thing, which is drugs, the juicy stuff, which everyone's waiting for. I know we wanted to do a little video on this, but just like briefly, if someone's looking to do their first cycle, for example me, that is me guys, in case you didn't know, I'm doing my first cycle very, very soon. What situation should they be in, we say body composition wise, and what should they be doing and getting in place before anything starts?
The first thing that you've got to consider is you need to have a big enough why to do it in the first place.
That's the most important thing.
This is something that could potentially be quite detrimental and harmful to your health physiologically and psychologically if misused. So from Josh's perspective, if he's going to embark on this, then he's going to get the advice from me and from other professionals and some medical professionals as well, to kind of how to approach this in the most optimal manner and be sensible about it as well, because there's lots of information out there on the internet. Most of it's shit, some of it's good now from people like Dr. Dean, and people are getting more informed as to how these things can be applied. But from grasping the basics of what we need to consider first, the position of health you're starting that at. So we need to get some form of baseline of blood work done. There are many providers of that. It's very easy to get hold of. That we look at specific health markers, actually looking at what your genetic, unassisted, natural set point for testosterone bound and free is, looking at LH and FSH, and looking at why potentially it is low, and if it is low in the first place. And there are things that we can identify from nutritional practices, or more so lifestyle practices, poor lifestyle, poor sleep, high stress. All these things start to impact the steroid hormone pathway, HPA axis, that will start to impact all these hormones. Maybe if that individual wanted to, I'd suggest address the things that were being performed badly, or lifestyle variables that were suboptimal first before even considering about using exogenous hormones. Because if we're going to go to the extent of injecting or taking some form of exogenous hormone and putting it in the body, you want to make darn sure that you're in the best possible position to respond to that in the first place. And that's not just fucking great at training, or I train really hard, or I eat loads of food. It's more so looking at the fundamentals that are going to optimize your health, and the fundamentals that are going to optimize your health and function will be the same things that will optimize your ability to respond to a drug. And that's going to come as managing stress. It's going to come optimizing your sleep. And realistically, if all of these things are managed and all these things are being optimized, your genetic set point and your natural level of hormones theoretically should be, within a range on a blood work panel. It shouldn't be low. There's going to be something that's causing that to be low if it is low. And we need to make sure that those fundamentals and those foundations are firmly established, which is Josh has essentially done that for the last 5 months with me every single week, every single day, before you even think about going down the route of assistance. Because most people see that as it's a fast track. It is not a fast track, because you're still going to have to do all the work and more
for years
and years and years to actually get anywhere close to where you think you could get to. And when assistance goes in, yes, you'll get a little bit stronger, yes, you'll get a little bit bigger, but it will still be the same case of, I'm not big enough, I'm not strong enough, I want to get bigger, I want to get stronger. I guarantee you'll never be satisfied where you are. The ballpark, the goalposts just change.
Absolutely. The day you set foot in the gym, it's the day you're not happy with your body ever again. always chasing more,
It's true.
It's so important to take that advice on board. Regardless, even if you're one of those people who just says, fuck it, I want to get big, like, it's ridiculous, because you are going to fuck your health up if you're not doing it properly. And with the bad information out there, which I would have been using and utilising, I was saying to Calum earlier, if I'd started a year ago, I would have been doing way higher doses that I'm going to be starting on. And who knows what that would have happened down the line. And also, if you do want to make a pro and you do want to, essentially rise to the top, a drug is a tool, and you need to creep that in over time and use that, because at the end of the day, those guys at the top, everyone's recovering well, everyone's training well, everyone's eating well, everyone's using drugs. It's just it can come down to what drugs work, come down to genetics, all that kind of stuff. So put everything in place beforehand. And then moving on to, I had a lot of questions, surprisingly. I'm surprised I get so many questions about people who do cycle, considering I've been natural for this long. But how often should people who do cycle on and off, should they be getting bloods done? Before, during, after, however many weeks? I've had a few clients who use, and they wanted to know, should they be doing the standard wait 2 weeks and then running PCD, which is one of the things I've been learning probably shouldn't be happening. What are the blood test situations?
So from a blood work perspective, if people aren't running blood work, it's either out of negligence or they just don't want to know what the blood work's going to tell them, because their health's probably in a compromised place, and they've been living in, they've just been being naive and kind of living in the dark in terms of not wanting to find out, but which is very common, by the way. But from the accessibility of being able to access private companies that will supply you with panels that will tell you essentially what's going on from a physiological perspective and from an endocrine perspective. The beauty of this now is if you go onto Medichecks, for example, you can pick individual markers that you want to test that are very, very cheap. So we might want to just test, if we're looking at someone's ability to aromatase and produce an aromatase enzyme, and we're worried about estrogen or we're worried about prolactin, we can test these individual markers. We don't need to run a big panel. It's going to cost hundreds of pounds. But from a general perspective, if you were to go on Medichecks and look at like the core Wellman test, which has basically everything you can think of, for anyone using assistance, I probably run that every quarter of the year. So every 4 months, 4 times a year, we get some from a baseline done just to see what's going on. From a prep perspective, where potentially somebody's going to be a little bit more aggressive with drug use, we'd want to run a full panel of bloods, covering all markers before that prep started. That prep shouldn't be taking place if that panel doesn't come back optimal and within range, within reason.
Okay.
If there are any indications of health being adverse during a cycle, that can come from the data that we're tracking that you said before about blood glucose, HRV, resting heart rate, or any kind of more tangible feedback, then you can run individual markers or you can run panels during prep to see what's going on. It's very, very easy to find out what's going on. Maybe we want to look at more specifically liver values, where maybe we want to look at more specifically a lipid profile, cholesterol, triglycerides. We want to look at inflammation and inflammatory markers. And then post-prep, I'd always have a period of time where someone just settles back into their more homeostatic state in regards to reducing stress load post-prep, maybe reducing output a little bit, maybe reducing training volume a little bit, tapering back drugs to what we'd consider being a cruise dose, a more sustainable dose. And then, 4 to 6 weeks after that, when we've got all the other shit sorted, then we can start to look at running blood work post-prep. And if markers are off, then we need to address and then run it again, 4 to 6 weeks or maybe a little bit longer, run it again, see where they are, and start to move from there. But essentially, if you're not running blood work, you're doing this entire process blind, and that is very, very dangerous. Regardless of whether you are feeling or aware of any adversity in terms of side effects on cycle or not, some of this stuff can happen without you even realizing, and then when you run bloods, markers are off and you're in a compromised state of health. So just if you're going to go through it, if you're going to go through that process, go down that route. Or if you're already on, if you're already using assistance, you're already using anabolics and you haven't in the past, just go and get it done, see what's going on, because you will thank yourself long term, because essentially it's your only medium of controlling what's going on and how to monitor things.
Yeah, I mean, I know the typical bro at the gym. I know a few of them at my gym, and they're taking a lot of gear, and they don't even know what a blood test is, and they complain about problems, and they take an Arimidex to fix a problem. But you can't take an Arimidex if you don't know what the problem is. You need to find out what the problem is. If you feel anything, get the blood test done. But to summarize, 3 to 4 times a year, when you finish your prep, wait 4 to 6 weeks, bring back down to a cruise, and then just consistently get those bloods done until you're back to where you need to be in an optimal range. I think it's super important for anyone to be doing this, because it's just so overlooked. The amount of people I hear that just don't do it, it's quite ridiculous. It's quite scary, to be honest. It's you know what, it's anywhere from 30 to 50 quid to get a full testosterone panel. Might even be cheaper now. And you're going to find out exactly what's out of whack and what's not. So there's no real excuse just for you to be on top of your own health. Because if you want to be doing this for a long time, you've got to be healthy.
I think from a blood work perspective, in terms of markers that people need to be aware of, if somebody's using an exogenous hormone, and testosterone is obviously most likely for everyone going to be one of them if they are, measuring testosterone, for example, on a blood panel is not going to tell you a lot, because you're using exogenous hormones, and if your gear is legit, it's going to be elevated. If you're looking at, aromatization, estrogen and prolactin are going to be something that you want to delve into and keep in track. If somebody's going to be using anti-aromatizing drugs, then don't just add them in willy-nilly because you read it on the internet. Actually see where those markers are, and then start to figure out a strategy to bring them down and manage them. Some people may not need to use any at all. Some people may need to use some if they use any exogenous hormone. It needs to be specific, it needs to be managed, it needs to be tracked. But from a health marker perspective, red and white blood cells and all the individual elements involved, C-reactive protein, HbA1c, kidney and liver markers and values, lipids and cholesterol, HDL and LDL, and LDL oxidation being an important one, are probably your most important go-to guys. So instead of looking at, I'm going to get my bloods done, I need to measure my testosterone to see if it's still high. Yeah. It's the least relevant. Relevant panel you need to be measuring. It's more so looking at those health markers that are going to have more of a direct impact on your health.
Yeah.
And like I said, are you sponsored by MediChex? You were collaborating.
Yeah, I just started working on them.
It's super cheap. And
it's really
just go and do it.
So easy. It's so easy. Cool. So I'd love to know your opinion on blast and cruising, because we had a little conversation downstairs about when I do start, would I come off? When would I come off? And it would essentially just be, I'll be on a low dose and would run that into the show. But if my ultimate goal is to be a pro, and to compete at the Olympia and to compete competitive at the Olympia, I do think that will dictate whether you blast and cruise, etc. But what's your take on blast and cruising? Should you ever come off if you're aiming for that goal? Do you need to resensitize? Do you need to get that natural access? Was it HPETA access? Do I need to get that access back? Is it gone forever? Is it going to come back? All that kind of stuff. That's a personal question.
The whole notion of having to resensitize is flawed. Like that's not required. The only reason logically that somebody will come off is because they were either going to maximize fertility to conceive, because conceiving whilst using exogenous hormones can be tricky. It's not saying it can't be done, but it's trickier, and or we've identified that a health marker is off. Even putting you on any form of exogenous hormone is going to still compromise the state of that health marker. We need to come off and reset properly and eradicate these hormones to essentially improve that health marker before reintroducing. Now, it's not to say, and for someone like Josh and for most people, if your long-term goal is to pursue bodybuilding and your long-term goal is to continue to maximize your ability to build lean tissue and pursue assisted bodybuilding or untested bodybuilding, and you know that drugs are going to be in your life for a long period of time, you will only need to cruise. You will only need to come off, for example, for those two reasons.
Okay.
I would prefer someone to stay on and just manage blood work than come off completely, because coming off can actually create a lot more problems than you could if you actually just stayed on it.
Which is crazy, because all people tell me is run this and then you've got to come off. You've got to come off your first one after 16 weeks. and yeah, it's just not the right information. So
and coming off in the first place is, again, when we look at the brutalization of what a PCT should be, that's another thing where people will go extremely off track in regards to how that should be approached, and again, something that can significantly compromise long-term health just by messing up that whole process. So the whole notion of blasting and cruising, there'll be times of the year within an off season where the goal is tissue, or within a prep where the goal is the extremes of body composition, where drug use will be more aggressive. Doesn't need to mean that it needs to be quote unquote high. It's what's high for relatively for that individual. There'll be times where you need to be more aggressive long term. For someone like Josh, not at all, because he's very new to this. But don't view it as there's an on and off. I need to come off after X amount of weeks. It's just, if you're monitoring your blood work, you know what's going on. Yeah. If something goes wrong, you may want to come off and reset that. If nothing's wrong, you don't need to come off.
Okay.
But there would be periods of time across the year where you taper down to reset.
Okay. And that'd be bring you back into a physiological.
It wouldn't be physiological.
It'd still be super.
You're still using.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Of course.
But you'd bring the amount you're taking down.
Yeah.
To essentially allow the body to put itself in a more optimal state of health, because you're being less aggressive with drug use. The higher those hormones go, the more adverse the side effects generally.
Okay.
But tapering that can improve that. But essentially, you're still on exogenous hormones, which means that the testes aren't going to be very happy with you, and the boys aren't going to work very well.
Yeah. Okay.
Regardless.
And then our question off that: will that always come back, or is there a chance it just might never come back?
Depends how you approach PCT.
Okay. So for example, you've got someone who's been on for 10 years. Are they less likely to come back on?
Some of that's genetics. Some of that's what they've. Most of that is how they've approached their drug use over that 10-year time frame.
Okay.
And then the rest of that is how they've approached the PCT process. Okay. But you'll hear of bodybuilders that have been on for decades and decades and have been extremely aggressive with drug use, and they come off, and the axis is restored pretty effectively.
Yeah.
Maybe after 1 or 2 bouts of HCG and then some form of amplifications from Clomid or Norvadex or whatever you want to use within a PCT. If it's approached properly, it can be really successful.
Yeah.
If it's not approached properly, then you're going to spend a long period of time with that not functioning properly.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of scaremongering in steroid use, and it's very demonized. I mean, I mentioned it to a few people. I'm a pretty open guy. I mentioned it to a few people. You just see their faces turn, and it's just the uneducated approach, and you can tell by the information that you guys are getting today that the information is there, and you can educate yourself before you get involved in this, and I think it's so important to do so.
It's like I don't know where I said it. I think I said it on Instagram the other day, but it's only demonized by the people that are uninformed.
Yeah.
If you know what you're talking about, or you know the sources of information that you should be listening to educate yourself, all of this stuff can be applied in a very quote unquote not the wrong word is safe, because it's never safe doing these things, but in a more optimal manner to preserve health.
Yeah.
The whole notion of being frowned upon and shunned in modern day society is just by people that have no clue what it actually is in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just one final question on the drugs. We kept you here long enough. What do you take and when? And how do you know when to take it? What makes X person take this versus X person take that? For example, I hear taking Winstrol on a prep is going to harden you up. When do you make that decision to take that? Is it... I assume it's dependent on all the variables and everything like that, but what kind of decisions... And also your drug lifetime, like what you've used and what you haven't. But what dictates what? For example, I saw TM Cycles. He's using T-Bol. I think he's using. I've never heard of it before in my life. Like what makes him use that versus something else? If that's even a question that can be answered.
Ultimately, all drugs within that toolbox are going to achieve a very similar physiological response in the body in terms of what it's doing. Some are going to aromatize more, some are going to aromatize less, some are going to hold more water, some are going to hold less water, some are going to be have a higher propensity to be androgenic than others. which is why people refer to like the strength of a drug for the purpose of gaining lean tissue, or anyone taking drugs will be looking to gain lean tissue. Some will be anabolic, some will be metabolic. Ultimately, the timings of those drugs will essentially be dictated on the goal within that phase. And if somebody is using drugs within an off season, they probably want a pretty big bang for their buck in regards to their ability to grow from that drug. But more so, then they're going to be less concerned about one's ability to keep water low, because they're not having to hold and peak a certain look, which means that they may be utilising drugs that will be having a higher capacity to aromatase, and then they transition into prep, and that will change because we need to get hard and dry and in condition on stage to bring a pretty complete look to stage. So now compounds in general will switch to potentially shorter esters, which are going to, for the majority, aromatize less and hold less water. So there are so many different forms and different esters of drugs available, but when people say like what's optimal for this, what's optimal for that, none of it is optimal for anything. It's just the timing of the type of compound you're using. And some are going to be less optimal in specific phases than others based on two factors: water and their ability to aromatize.
Absolutely. Perfect. If any of you guys want any more of this information, head over to Calum's Instagram page, head over to the Muscle Mentors podcast.
Listen to Dean's podcast.
Yeah, listen to Dr. Dean's podcast with the Muscle Mentors. It was quite a listen, and debunked a lot of the stuff that I'd been reading, and quite honestly stuff that I was believing. So I think the key take homes of today are: get educated before you even think about this kind of stuff. Make sure you're maximizing everything optimally in terms of recovery, training, and nutrition. And reach out, get help. You know, people like Calum are here for a reason. He's got a mission. We've all got a mission, and it's to educate and to dominate. So get in touch. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you, Calum, for coming on, and we'll speak to you guys soon. Peace.